I was hauling a load through the heart of the Midwest one late autumn night, heading down an old stretch of Route 66. The road was long, straight, and empty. It was the kind of highway that felt like it went on forever, and the only thing keeping me awake was the hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of my headlights illuminating the vast, desolate landscape. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the first sign of something out of the ordinary happened. I was about 30 miles from the nearest town, just outside a place that had been practically forgotten by time. I had seen a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror for what felt like hours. At first, I thought it was just another truck, maybe a few miles behind me. But as time went on, the headlights didn't fade. They stayed at the same distance, like they were glued to my bumper. At one point, I checked my mirrors again and saw nothing but the faint glow of headlights in the distance. Thinking it was strange, I slowed down a bit, giving the driver behind me a chance to pass, but the lights didn't get any closer. They stayed exactly where they were, and I could feel my unease growing with each passing mile. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the headlights disappeared. I didn't hear anything either, not even the roar of another engine. I glanced around and saw nothing, just the black void of the road stretching out before me, the wind howling, and the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to shake it off and went back to focusing on the road, but it wasn't long before I started hearing strange noises in the cab. Soft tapping against the window and faint scraping sounds. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, maybe a branch or some debris, but the sounds didn't stop. They grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I flicked on the interior lights, looked around, but nothing was there, just the empty cabin. My heart was starting to race, and I couldn't explain why. I had driven through plenty of long stretches of isolated roads before, but this felt different. Something felt off. I glanced at my GPS, hoping to focus on something more tangible. The screen showed that I was still on Route 66, miles from any exit or gas station. The road ahead was a winding mess of curves and dark stretches, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was the tires of my rig on the pavement, but no, these were deliberate, heavy footsteps, as if someone was walking beside the truck. My stomach turned over in an instant. I looked in my mirrors, but there was no one there, no one in sight. Yet I could hear those footsteps clear as day, coming closer, pacing alongside me. They were almost in rhythm with the truck's movement, like someone or something was keeping pace with me at a steady walk. Panic surged through me. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, trying to speed up, but the footsteps only seemed to follow faster, closing the gap. The sound was growing louder, closer to my door. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might have been imagining it. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart across the road. It was brief but unmistakable, like a figure moving just out of reach, trying to stay hidden in the dark. I was terrified, but I forced myself to keep going. The sound of those footsteps never stopped. They stayed with me for miles, growing louder and louder, almost as if whatever it was had gotten closer to the truck itself. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to pull over, gather my thoughts, figure out if I was losing my mind. So I turned on my blinker and eased off the road. The truck came to a stop on the shoulder, and I sat there, hands gripping the wheel, chest tight as I tried to calm myself. The engine was still running, but there was no sign of anything unusual. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then the tapping started again, but this time it was coming from the passenger side. I snapped my head toward the window. I could see my reflection in the glass, the dark highway stretching behind me, and that was when I saw it. A pale face, pressed against the glass from the outside, staring directly at me. A man, maybe, but his features were twisted in a grotesque way, his eyes wide open, unblinking, with an expression of hunger and madness that made my blood run cold. His skin was deathly pale, like something long dead, and his mouth stretched into a thin, sinister grin. I gasped and slammed my foot onto the accelerator, pulling back onto the road without thinking. The figure remained in my peripheral vision, standing in the shadows just off to the side, but when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't dare stop again. I drove straight through the night, the rest of my trip a blur of confusion and terror. The footsteps never returned, but I kept hearing strange noises, whispers that seemed to come from the radio, faint but chilling, like a voice trying to speak through static. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the sinister presence of something following me. It wasn't until I hit a small truck stop near dawn that I finally let myself breathe again. I pulled in to refuel, still trembling, still hearing the echoes of the footsteps in my mind. I found a man there, sitting by the counter, drinking his coffee and staring into space like he had been there forever. He glanced at me when I walked in. "You're the driver on 66, right?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly. "Yeah, I am," I said, swallowing hard. "How did you—" He cut me off with a sad shake of his head. "That stretch of road's bad news for people like you," he said, his voice distant like he was speaking from experience. "Happens all the time." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't bring myself to ask what he meant. "You're lucky you made it through the night," he added. "If the spirits around here—" They follow trucks down that stretch of road, hitching rides, trying to catch a ride out of wherever they came from. They've been known to crawl into cabins, leave marks on the windows. Some of them get real aggressive, too. He didn't say anything more, but his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Whatever had been following me on Route 66 wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was something real. Something that no one could escape once it decided to latch on. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had experienced out there wasn't over. I haven't driven that stretch of road since, and I don't plan to again. Something about that night, that feeling of being hunted, never left me. I've heard of others, fellow truckers, who've had similar stories. They talk about seeing figures on the road in the dead of night, shadows that move too fast to catch, and the strange tapping or scratching noises that seem to come from nowhere. If you ever find yourself driving late at night on Route 66, keep an eye on the shadows. You never know who or what might be walking beside you.
Next story.
It was a cold and foggy night when it all began. I had been hauling freight across the Midwest, making my usual rounds on the I-70. The trucker's life, as you know, isn't glamorous. It's long stretches of highway, a lot of lonely hours on the road, and the occasional stop at an old diner or truck stop. But that night, I was on my own, just trying to get through the night shift, heading toward a small town in Missouri to drop off some cargo. I remember the radio was playing some old country song, something about lost love and broken dreams, but it was drowned out by the constant hum of the truck's engine and the rhythmic noise of the wheels rolling over the asphalt. The lights of the highway stretched out in front of me like a never-ending tunnel, and the fog seemed to grow thicker the further I drove. You could barely see a few feet ahead. Then, I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fog. You know how it is. Your mind plays games with you when you're tired and alone. But as I drew closer, I saw the woman standing by the side of the road. She was in a long, tattered white dress, her hair dark and wild, blowing in the wind like it was alive. She didn't look real. She was standing so still, like a statue. I slowed down, instinctively feeling a pang of concern. I wasn't exactly in a populated area. The closest town was at least an hour away, and there were no lights around, just the eerie quiet of the night. I figured she might need help. I've picked up hitchhikers before, especially when it's been cold, but something felt off this time. There was an odd energy in the air, something I couldn't explain. I pulled the truck over, the tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. I turned off the engine, letting the silence hang in the air for a second. My heart was beating a little faster than usual, but I chalked it up to the isolation. I didn't know it then, but that moment would be the beginning of a nightmare I'd never forget. I rolled down the window and the woman slowly turned her head toward me. Her eyes, they were pure black. No whites, no pupils, just empty, hollow voids. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't back away. Maybe I was too tired to think straight. I called out to her. "Hey, you all right? You need a ride?" For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just stood there, her face blank, like she was weighing something in her mind. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she said, "I need to get to the other side." I frowned. "The other side? What do you mean? You want me to take you to the next town?" She didn't answer. Instead, she took a slow step forward, and I felt the temperature in the air drop even more. It was as if the fog was seeping into the truck, surrounding me. I could barely see her now, just that pale, ghostly figure emerging from the fog. "I have to get to the other side," she repeated, her voice barely audible. Her eyes never left me, and it was like they were drilling into my soul. Against every instinct in my body, I opened the door and stepped out of the truck. I didn't even question it. I was drawn to her, like I had no choice. As I walked toward her, I could feel a strange sensation in my chest, like something was tightening around my heart. She smiled, and the sight of it made my blood run cold. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was wrong. The corners of her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, showing teeth that weren't human. They were long and jagged, like a predator's fangs. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, and I spun around. The truck was gone. It had vanished. My truck, my cargo, everything I had worked for, gone, like it was never there. "Where is it?" I gasped, panic rising in my throat. "What did you do?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her body floating inches off the ground. Her dress fluttered as if it were blowing in a wind that wasn't there. I tried to back away, but my legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the ground. I couldn't move. And then I heard the voices. At first, it was a whisper, just faint murmurs in the distance. But as the seconds ticked by, the whispers grew louder and clearer. They were voices of other truckers, their tones filled with terror and confusion. "Where is she? Where is she taking us?" "She's coming for you next, man. Get out of here. Run." I looked around frantically, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the fog was so thick now, it was as if I was in a different world, a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. And then I saw them, other truckers. But they weren't alive. They were like shadows, their faces twisted in horror, their eyes wide and empty. They floated around the woman, their voices calling out to me. They were trapped, just like me, and I was next. I heard a voice inside my head, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from every direction. It wasn't the woman's voice. It was something older, something darker. "You shouldn't have stopped," the voice said. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't breathe. I felt the air pressing in around me, the weight of the fog bearing down on me like 1,000 pounds. The woman reached out and touched my arm, her fingers cold as ice. And in that moment, I knew what she was. She was death. Her grip tightened, and I felt the life draining from me. My vision blurred, the world around me spinning as I felt myself falling into the void. The whispers of the lost truckers surrounded me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my truck. The engine was running, the lights of the highway stretched out in front of me, and the radio was playing the same country song. But something was wrong. I looked around. The road was clear, the fog was gone, and yet I felt different. I felt like I had been changed, like something inside me had been ripped away. I glanced at the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see anyone behind me. The road was empty, and I was alone. But then, as I pulled over to check my truck, I saw it. In the passenger seat, just for a moment, I saw her reflection, her pale face, her dark eyes staring back at me. I jerked back, heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door shut and sped off, not caring if I was breaking every rule of the road. I wasn't going to stop again. Not for anything. I've never been the same since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face, hear those whispers. I hear the lost souls of the other truckers, still trapped in that fog, and I know they're waiting for me. I don't know how, but I know. One day they'll come for me again. Until then, I keep driving, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I'll make it through another night without her.
Next story.
I was on my usual route through the back roads of Wyoming, a long stretch of desolate highway with nothing but the occasional deer or coyote to break up the monotony. I had been driving for hours, and the solitude was starting to get to me. There's something about these roads, late at night, that makes you feel like you're the last person on Earth. It gets into your bones. You start hearing things that aren't there, seeing shapes in the corner of your eye, but you push it aside, focus on the road ahead, because that's what you have to do. I was coming up on a stretch of highway where the nearest town was at least 30 miles away. It was nearly 3 a.m. when I noticed something strange in the distance, flashes of light. At first, I thought it was just a reflection of my headlights on a sign or something, but as I got closer, the lights seemed to flicker in a pattern. They were moving, almost as if they were signaling me. I slowed down, curiosity pulling me in. As I got closer, I saw it. A truck. It was an older rig, not something you'd expect to see on the road anymore. The truck was parked on the shoulder, its lights flashing in a weird, rhythmic pattern, but there was no driver in sight. I slowed even further and eventually stopped behind the truck, my engine humming in the otherwise quiet night. I waited for a moment, wondering if the driver had just stepped out for a minute. But there was something about the way the truck sat on the road, so still, like it was frozen in time, that didn't sit right with me. I grabbed my flashlight from the passenger seat and stepped out of my cab. The cold hit me immediately, the air crisp and sharp. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked toward the truck. The closer I got, the more unsettled I became. I could feel it in my chest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, a strange energy in the air. I stood just a few feet from the truck, shining the light through the windshield. There was no sign of the driver, but the interior was oddly neat. Not a single item out of place. The truck's engine was off, and there was no indication of any kind of struggle or problem. It was just sitting there, waiting. I knocked on the door, then waited. No response. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I could feel the anxiety bubbling up inside me. Maybe the driver had broken down and walked for help, but then why hadn't he left his lights on, or at least left a note? I took a deep breath and decided to get back in my truck. Just as I turned to walk away, I heard it. A soft, muffled sound, like the sound of someone dragging something heavy across the gravel. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound was coming from behind me, and before I could react, I felt something, or rather, someone, breathe down my neck. I spun around, my heart hammering, but there was no one there. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if something was just out of sight, watching me, waiting. I quickly got back in my cab, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. My hands were shaking as I shifted into gear, desperate to get away from whatever I had just felt. But as I pulled away, my headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. Something I hadn't seen before. The truck. It wasn't alone anymore. The driver was there, standing outside the rig, staring at me with hollow eyes. He was tall, impossibly tall, his face pale as death, his clothes tattered like he'd been stranded for days. His skin was stretched tight over his bones like he hadn't eaten in weeks, and he wasn't moving, just standing there, staring. I slammed on the brakes, my foot pressing hard against the pedal, but when I turned around, the truck was gone. There was nothing behind me, just the empty highway, stretching on forever. I looked back at my rearview mirror, but there was no trace of the man, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. I was alone, but I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. That thing had been there. And now I was sure of one thing. It was following me. For the next few miles, I could feel it, watching. There was no sound, no movement, just the unnerving sensation that something was out there lurking just out of sight. I kept my eyes on the road, not daring to look in the mirrors. I didn't want to see what was there. I passed a small, rundown diner off the side of the highway, and something made me pull over. It was either my gut telling me to stop or the desperate need for some company. I don't know. Maybe it was the instinct to be around people, to convince myself I wasn't going crazy. I parked my rig and stepped out of the cab, the cold air biting into my skin. I made my way inside the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly. The place was almost empty, save for an old man sitting at the counter, sipping on coffee. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes tired but sharp. "You're a long way from home, son," he said, his voice rough as if he hadn't spoken in days. I nodded, trying to shake off the unease. "Yeah, just passing through. Thought I'd grab a coffee." The man didn't respond, just nodded slowly and went back to his coffee. I took a seat near the window, my mind still racing. The truck, the figure, everything that had happened, it felt unreal. I ordered a cup of coffee, and as the waitress brought it over, she glanced out the window, her face paling just a little. "You're not one of them, are you?" she asked quietly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "That truck, the one that passes by every night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It never stops. Not for gas, not for food. It just keeps going. The driver, he's not a real person. Not anymore. He died years ago. But he's still out there, still driving." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had heard stories, but I never thought they were true. "What do you mean, still driving?" The truck is a kind of curse, she explained. It keeps going, picking up lost souls, ones who have nowhere else to go, and once it finds you, it won't stop until it gets you. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I knew deep down that it was true. The man I had seen, it wasn't just a ghost. He was a part of something far worse, something tied to this cursed stretch of road. And now I was part of it too. I didn't wait for another word. I grabbed my coffee, tossed a few bills on the counter, and ran out the door. I needed to get out of there, as far away from that truck as I could. But as I started up my rig, I saw it again, just a faint shadow in the distance, creeping toward me through the night. The truck wasn't done with me.
Next story.
It was one of those nights when the wind seemed to howl louder than usual, and the sky was thick with the kind of clouds that make you feel like something's watching you. My name's Carl, and I've been a trucker for over a decade now, but there was one night that still haunts me to this day. One night I'll never forget. I was coming off a long haul from Chicago, heading down an isolated stretch of I-70 deep in the heart of Kansas. There's not much to see out there, just fields, barns, and old abandoned gas stations that have been left to rot in the dirt. That stretch of road is known for being desolate, but it's also one of those routes where you just keep your eyes on the road and try not to think about how alone you are. I'd been driving for hours, the hum of the tires against the pavement soothing me into a kind of trance. It was around 3 a.m. when I first saw her. I was passing a beat-up old truck stop when I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. She was a woman. At least, I think it was a woman. She was wearing a long white dress and her hair hung loose around her face, almost covering her features. I could barely see her eyes, but something about the way she stood there, unmoving, just didn't sit right with me. It was strange. No car in sight, no other vehicles passing by. I've seen hitchhikers before, but they're usually in better conditions. This one looked wrong. There was something off about the way the night seemed to bend around her, like the shadows were reaching toward her. I kept my distance, but as I passed, I saw her eyes, pale, almost ghostly white, and they locked with mine through the driver's side mirror. My blood ran cold, and for a split second, I felt like I couldn't move. My foot instinctively pressed on the brake, but then I snapped out of it and floored the gas pedal. The truck roared forward, the woman's figure disappearing into the darkness. But that wasn't the last time I saw her. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. I needed to focus on the road. But as the minutes ticked by, the air around me felt heavier. My headlights suddenly started flickering. At first, it was just a quick blink, but then it became more consistent, blinking on and off like some sort of signal. I had been driving that truck for years, and I knew it wasn't the electrical system acting up. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the distance. I looked out the window, and there, walking along the edge of the road, was the woman again. But this time, she was closer. Much closer. I slammed my foot on the brake and swerved to the side of the road, nearly losing control of the truck. I stopped just short of the shoulder, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to stop. I couldn't keep going like this. I had to figure out what was going on. I looked into my mirrors, half expecting her to be there, standing just behind me. But there was nothing, no one, just the empty stretch of highway. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I pulled back onto the road, my hands tight on the wheel, my eyes constantly flicking between the rear view and the road ahead. But as I drove, the feeling didn't go away. Every time I looked into the mirrors, I could swear I saw her standing just behind me, her pale face staring at me. And then in the reflection, I saw something I'll never forget. A figure, tall, gaunt, with long arms and long fingers, too long to be human. The thing was crouched down beside the truck, moving along the side, its face twisted in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Its eyes were like deep pits, black, endless, and staring right into me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My foot was frozen to the gas pedal. In the reflection, the creature began to get closer. Its fingers scraped against the side of the truck, and a horrible, dragging noise filled the air. It was as if the very sound of its movement was clawing at my soul. I snapped out of it and slammed on the brakes again, this time almost throwing myself forward in the seat. The truck skidded, tires screeching against the asphalt. I pulled off the highway, heart racing, hands shaking. The creature, whatever it was gone, but I could still feel its presence in the air. I shut off the engine, my body tense, and just sat there in the dark. I couldn't see anything. There was no woman, no creature, nothing. But I knew something had been with me, something that wasn't human. I didn't know what to do. There were no other trucks on the road, no one to talk to. The truck stop I had passed earlier was miles behind me, and I wasn't about to turn back there. So, I did what any trucker in my situation would do. I decided to drive through the night. Just keep going. Keep moving. I started the engine again and began to roll down the road, praying that the darkness would release its grip on me. The miles passed, the sky slowly lightening as dawn approached. But even as the first light of day broke through, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. And that's when I heard the voice. It was faint at first, just a whisper carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was her, the woman from the road. Her voice was soft, almost mournful, as if she was begging me to stop. The wind shifted and the words became clearer. Help me. Please, help me. The voice seemed to come from all around me, and in the distance I saw a shadow move along the side of the highway again. But this time I didn't stop. I couldn't. I drove faster, not caring about the road signs, not caring about the law. My only goal was to get away. But the voice kept following me. It echoed in my mind, filling every thought, every moment. And no matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I went, I knew she was still out there. Still watching. I don't know who she was or what she wanted from me. I don't know if it was a spirit or something else, but I've never been the same since that night. Every time I drive down that stretch of highway, I feel her presence watching me from the side of the road. And every time I pass that truck stop, I can't help but wonder if she's still out there waiting for her next ride. But I'll never stop there again.
Next story.
I've been a trucker for over 20 years, and I've seen my share of strange things, but nothing that's ever stuck with me like this. It happened a few years ago when I was on a late-night run across a stretch of road in the Appalachian Mountains. The route I was on is notorious for its curves and hills, and you don't get many travelers out there after dark. I was hauling a load of electronics from North Carolina to Tennessee, a familiar route for me, though this particular night, something felt off. I had just passed through a small town and had a few hours left before I was supposed to reach my destination. The mountains were quiet, the road winding up ahead, and I was getting into a zone, just me and the truck, my headlights cutting through the night. The usual night noises were there, the hum of the tires, the wind, the occasional bird call. But there was an eerie stillness too. It was the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums. Around midnight, I came up to a curve in the road, one of those sharp ones where you almost have to crawl around it. It was strange. I'd been on this route countless times and I knew this curve well, but tonight there was something different about it. I felt uneasy. I slowed down, taking the turn cautiously when I saw something in the road ahead. A figure standing right in the middle of the highway, barely visible in the beam of my headlights. At first, I thought it was just a stray animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but as I got closer, I could tell it was a person. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, facing away from me. I couldn't see much, just the silhouette of a man in a dark coat standing still as stone. Something didn't sit right with me. Why was he out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? I honked my horn a couple of times, hoping to get his attention, but he didn't budge. I was about to roll down the window to yell at him when something strange happened. The man slowly turned around. The expression on his face made my blood run cold. His skin was deathly pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in years, and his eyes, they were pitch black. Not the usual dark eyes you see, but solid black. No whites, just voids staring straight at me. I couldn't look away. It was like my body froze, unable to do anything but stare. For a second, I thought I saw something in his hand, but the next thing I knew, he was gone. Just vanished. It didn't make sense. There was nowhere for him to go, no trees, no bushes, no cliffs, just the straight highway and the mountains on either side. I got out of the truck and looked around, hoping to make sense of what had just happened. But the road was empty. No man, no footprints, nothing. I searched around for a minute, my mind racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. I got back in the truck, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, but I felt it. Something was following me now, lingering in the air, pressing against the walls of the truck. I kept my eyes on the road, hoping I wouldn't see the figure again, but every time I glanced in the mirrors, I saw the same thing. Nothing. Just the dark stretch of mountain road behind me. But that wasn't the end of it. It wasn't even close. About 10 miles down the road, I started hearing things, soft whispers, as if someone was speaking just below the noise of the engine, but too faint for me to understand. I turned the radio down, thinking maybe it was static or a trick of the sound system, but the whispers continued, growing louder. Then it turned into a low, almost guttural laugh, followed by a voice, deep and raspy. Keep driving, don't stop." My heart skipped a beat. I quickly scanned the mirrors again, but there was still nothing. Just the mountains and the road stretching on into the dark. But the voice didn't stop. It kept repeating that same thing over and over, like it was coming from the very air around me. "Don't stop." I slammed my foot on the accelerator, speeding up even more. I wanted to get away from whatever was out there, from whatever was speaking to me in the darkness. But the laughter grew louder, and I could feel the temperature drop in the truck, a chill creeping up my spine. My breath fogged up the windshield. I don't know how long I drove. It could have been hours, it could have been minutes. But eventually I came to a point where the road was flat and the trees started thinning out. I thought I might be near the end of the mountain pass, maybe closer to town, so I slowed down. I needed to check myself, see if I was imagining things. But as I slowed, the voice stopped. The laughing stopped. The whispers went silent. And that's when I saw it. A black figure standing by the side of the road, the same figure I had seen earlier, the man in the coat. But now he was just standing there, staring into the darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Something inside me screamed to keep going, to get away, but I was paralyzed with fear. The man slowly turned his head, and once again, his eyes were black as coal. I could feel his gaze, even through the glass, piercing into me, drawing me in. "Go back," he whispered, his voice low and crackling, like it was coming from the very earth itself. "Go back and join me." I didn't wait another second. My foot slammed down on the gas pedal, and I roared past him, my engine roaring louder than ever. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I kept going until the sun came up, until the road opened up and the trees were behind me. I finally pulled into a rest stop a few miles outside of town, my hands still shaking, my heart still pounding. I sat there for what felt like forever, just trying to calm myself. I never told anyone what happened that night, not even my wife. I'm not sure if anyone would believe me, but I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I'll never drive through those mountains again.
Next story.
It was a typical Thursday night, the kind that blends into every other long haul I've ever done. I had just left a small truck stop outside of St. Louis, Missouri, and was heading north toward a delivery in Chicago. The road was empty, the kind of empty that makes you feel like you're the only soul left on earth. Just me, my rig, and the constant hum of the engine. The radio was dead, static buzzing in my ears, which wasn't unusual for these backcountry highways. I liked the quiet, the isolation. Sometimes when the world gets too noisy, it's easier to lose yourself in the road. Around midnight, I noticed a truck up ahead, a little far off in the distance, its lights barely visible through the darkness. I didn't think much of it at first. Truckers are a brotherhood. We all share the road. You see one up ahead, you know you'll catch up sooner or later. It's the way it's always been. But something was off about this one. As I got closer, I realized that there were no lights on the truck. It was moving, but the only thing visible was a faint outline of the rig. No headlights, no taillights, just the shape of a truck cutting through the darkness. My instincts kicked in and I hit the horn twice, just to make sure they knew I was there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I wasn't one to spook easily, but this was different. The truck didn't respond. I flashed my high beams. Nothing. I pulled up alongside it, still a good distance away, but close enough to see the faint silhouette of the driver behind the wheel. He wasn't moving. His hands were gripped tight on the wheel, his face turned slightly toward the road, but he never once looked at me. "Hey, you good over there?" I shouted, but my voice barely carried over the engine noise. There was no reply, no acknowledgement. I slowed down, trying to match his pace. This wasn't right. It was like he was in some kind of trance, just driving forward, completely unaware of the world around him. Something deep in my gut told me to leave it alone, but I couldn't help myself. I was a curious man, and curiosity has a way of getting the better of you. I rolled down my window, trying to get a better look at the trucker. He looked wrong. His face was pale, almost gray, like he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. His clothes were tattered, as if he hadn't bothered to change in days, maybe longer. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, but there was no life in them. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. A figure standing just behind the trucker's cabin, half hidden by the fog. It was a man. No, not a man. He was too tall, too thin, his limbs twisted in unnatural angles. The thing was dressed in ragged clothes, its head tilted at an odd angle, staring directly at me with hollow eyes. My heart stopped for a moment. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, pushing my truck ahead, hoping to put as much distance between me and whatever I had just seen. I glanced in my side mirror, but the truck was gone. The road behind me was empty. I didn't slow down, not for miles. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was just fatigue, or maybe I was seeing things. I wasn't new to the isolation of the road, but this felt different. This felt real. A few miles later, I pulled into a small, dilapidated rest stop. My body was screaming for a break. I needed to clear my head. I climbed out of the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel, and stretched my sore muscles. The night air was cold, biting at my skin. The rest stop was deserted. No other trucks, no signs of life. I was just about to grab a drink from my cooler when I heard it. A faint noise, like the scraping of metal on stone coming from the far end of the lot. It was too quiet, and the noise was so soft, so distant, that I almost dismissed it. But then I heard it again, louder this time. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. At the far end of the rest stop, hidden in the shadows, was a figure. A person, standing unnaturally still, just staring at me. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was tall, too tall, with the same ragged clothes I had seen before, like the thing that had been on the truck. But now, it was closer. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. There was something wrong about its posture. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was observing me from a distance, calculating. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. Then the figure took a step toward me, one slow, deliberate step. I turned and sprinted back to my truck, adrenaline coursing through my veins, the sound of my boots pounding on the gravel. I didn't stop to look back. I jumped into the cab, locked the doors, and fired up the engine. But as I looked in my side mirror, I saw it again. The figure was standing at the edge of the lot, just outside the range of my headlights. It wasn't moving, not yet, but I could feel it watching me, waiting. I didn't wait for it to come closer. I slammed the gear shift into drive and tore out of the rest stop, speeding down the road as fast as I could. I didn't care about the speed limit anymore. I didn't care about anything except putting miles between me and whatever that thing was. Hours passed, and the trucker's figure faded from my memory, but the eerie feeling that had crawled into my chest refused to leave. I tried to focus on the road, on the hum of the engine beneath me, but I couldn't shake the thought that the road itself had changed. It was like I was in a place I wasn't supposed to be, somewhere between worlds. When I reached Chicago the next morning, I parked my rig at the terminal, my body still shaking. I stepped out of the truck, only to see something that made my blood run cold. Across the lot, standing at the entrance to the truck stop, was the same figure from the rest stop. Its head was tilted, its hollow eyes staring right at me, as if it had been waiting all along. I didn't stick around to find out what it wanted. I loaded up my truck and left. Some things are better left unexplored.
Next story.
I've been driving the long haul for over 15 years, but I can't shake the memory of what happened one late night in the middle of nowhere. I've told this story to a couple of guys on the road, but each time their faces just freeze, and we all kind of laugh it off like it was nothing. But believe me, it was something. It started like any other night. I was hauling a load from Denver, heading south to Albuquerque. The roads were clear, the skies dark, and I had a long stretch of highway ahead of me. I remember thinking that this trip was going to be easy. There were no big traffic jams, no bad weather, just me, my truck, and the black ribbon of asphalt stretching ahead. By midnight, I was cruising down I-40, the hum of the engine lulling me into a steady rhythm. I had my coffee beside me and the radio barely making a sound, just the occasional crackle of static. That's when I saw the lights in my rear view. At first, I thought it was another trucker, maybe someone running a little too close behind, trying to make up time. But when I glanced in the mirror again, I saw nothing. The lights had disappeared. Strange, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, or the tiredness was finally starting to catch up. About 30 minutes later, the lights appeared again, this time way off in the distance. But they were brighter, moving faster, coming up on me fast. I figured the guy was trying to pass me, but when the truck didn't pull alongside, I started to feel a little uneasy. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I kept driving, but now I was more aware of the road. And that's when I heard the tapping. At first, I thought it was the truck's engine making a strange sound, maybe a loose bolt or something, but it was rhythmic, soft, like someone knocking on the door. I glanced over at the passenger seat, but it was empty. No one there. Still, the tapping continued. My heart began to race. It wasn't the truck, it wasn't the engine. The sound was coming from outside, somewhere near the cab. But where? I pulled over to the side of the road, killing the engine. The sound stopped immediately. The highway was dead quiet. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the road. I sat there for a minute, just listening. Nothing, no wind, no birds, no cars, nothing. I convinced myself that it was nothing, just some weird glitch, some trick my mind was playing on me due to exhaustion. After a couple of minutes, I started the truck up again and rolled back onto the highway, hoping to put the whole thing behind me. But then, it happened again. The lights were closer this time, blinding in my rear view. I checked the mirrors, but once again, there was nothing there. The lights were gone. I tried to shake it off, tried to ignore it, but that's when I saw something in front of me. A figure. A man standing in the middle of the road, barely visible in the darkness. He was wearing a faded, torn-up jacket and his head was tilted to the side. The way he was standing made my stomach turn. It was like he wasn't quite right. I slammed on the brakes, swerving to avoid him, but when I looked back, he was gone. Now I know what you're thinking. Or just maybe it was some stray hitchhiker or someone out there to mess with truckers, but I swear to you, I didn't see a car or anything nearby. The man wasn't walking, he was just standing there, like he was waiting for something. I pulled over again, my heart racing in my chest. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I knew I had to keep moving, but the fear was overwhelming. That's when the tapping came again. Louder. Persistent. And it was coming from the passenger side. I didn't even want to look, but I had to. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat, and that's when I saw it. A face. The face was pressed up against the window, its eyes wide, unblinking, like they were staring right through me. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The face, pale, gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its skull, just stared at me. It had an unsettling grin, and its teeth were sharp, jagged, like a predator. The figure's breath fogged up the glass, but the face never moved. For what felt like an eternity, I just stared back, my mind racing for something, anything to do. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The figure was no longer at the window. But the tapping continued. Now I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the truck into gear, and I tore down the road as fast as I could. I didn't care about speed limits or getting caught or anything. I just needed to get away from whatever this was. The road ahead was blurry, my eyes full of tears from the adrenaline and fear. The truck roared under me as I sped faster. And that's when I saw the lights in front of me, those same lights from earlier. But this time, they were too close. They were right in front of me. My stomach dropped. There was no way it could be another truck. The lights were too big, too bright, like they were coming straight at me. I slammed on the brakes, but nothing happened. The truck kept moving forward, and the lights didn't dim or move away. They were getting closer, and my heart was in my throat. I could feel the weight of something heavy something dangerous closing in on me. And then the lights went out just as fast as they had appeared. The truck came to a sudden stop. The engine died, and for a second, I sat there in total silence. The tapping had stopped. The face at the window was gone, but that eerie, suffocating silence lingered. I don't know how long I sat there, but I couldn't make myself move. I was paralyzed. When I finally turned the key and the engine roared back to life, I didn't stop driving. I didn't stop until I pulled into a gas station in the middle of nowhere, my hands trembling, my breath ragged. I never spoke to anyone about what happened, not until now. That night, I don't know what I saw, whether it was a ghost or a spirit or something even worse. All I know is that something was out there, something that was waiting for me. Now, every time I drive at night, I keep my eyes on the road, but sometimes I swear I can feel those lights behind me, and every now and then I hear the faintest tapping. I'll never be the same after that night.
Next story.
I've been driving trucks for over 15 years, and you'd think I'd be used to the long, lonely stretches of highway by now. But there's one place I've never gotten used to. One stretch of road that still gives me chills every time I pass it. It's not the mountains or the forests, but an old, forgotten bridge deep in the heart of Kentucky. It happened one late autumn night around 1:30 a.m. when I was hauling a load of construction materials through the back roads of the state. It was a shortcut I took to avoid the busy highways, though the road was often narrow and winding. There were no other trucks on it at that hour, and I knew I'd be alone until I reached the next town. The night was unusually foggy, the thick mist rolling in from the valleys like a ghostly veil. My headlights barely cut through it, and I kept my speed low, especially on the curves. The road felt abandoned, forgotten, like it was meant to be left behind. I had driven it dozens of times, but tonight was different. There was something in the air, an eerie weight to it, like the world had quieted down just for me. I reached a point where the road opened up, and there, in the distance, was the old bridge. Now, this bridge had always been there. Rusty, weathered, and barely holding together, its wood planks creaking under the pressure of time. It wasn't used much anymore, probably because it was so old and unstable. There were always signs warning drivers to avoid it, but the shortcut was too tempting, and I had crossed it countless times. But that night, something made me hesitate. I slowed as I approached the bridge, the fog thickening, the wooden planks almost invisible beneath the mist. The air grew heavier, and I could feel my pulse quickening. It was as if the bridge was calling me, pulling me toward it, and I couldn't explain why. I made my way onto the bridge, the truck's tires creaking on the old wood. But then something strange happened. The sounds stopped. The usual hum of the engine, the hiss of the air brakes, they all went silent. The truck was still moving, but the noise was gone. It was like I had entered a vacuum, and I could hear nothing but my own breathing. At first, I thought it was just the fog messing with my senses. But then I saw it. A figure appeared out of the mist, standing at the far end of the bridge. I slammed on the brakes, barely managing to keep control of the truck as I skidded to a stop. The figure was tall, dressed in a dark, weathered coat, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. They stood motionless, staring at me through the fog. No movement, no sound. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. My gut twisted in fear. Something wasn't right. I could feel the weight of the figure's stare, like it was pulling me in, beckoning me to get out of the truck. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe they'd step aside, maybe wave me on, but they didn't. They just stood there, unblinking, unmoving. A chill crept through my veins as the fog seemed to close in around me, thickening until the figure was the only thing I could focus on. I couldn't see the end of the bridge, couldn't tell where the road continued, just that fog and the eerie figure ahead of me. My hands were shaking, and for the first time in years, I felt completely helpless. I glanced at the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was just as obscured by the fog. I couldn't go forward. I couldn't turn around. It felt like time had frozen, like I was stuck in this moment, unable to move forward or back. The figure still stood there, just watching me. I don't know what came over me, but suddenly, I couldn't take it anymore. My foot slammed on the accelerator, and the truck roared forward, speeding toward the figure. As I neared the middle of the bridge, I braced myself for whatever might happen, hoping the figure would move or I'd finally break free from the fog that was starting to choke me. But the moment I hit the middle of the bridge, everything changed. The figure stepped forward, and for the first time, I saw its face. Its skin was ashen, pale, almost like it had been drained of life. Its eyes were hollow, black, voids of nothingness. And its mouth, it was twisted into a smile, but not the kind of smile you'd expect. It was wide, far too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face, revealing teeth that were jagged, like something out of a nightmare. I screamed, slamming the wheel to the side and jerking the truck away, barely avoiding a collision with the railing of the bridge. The engine roared as I gunned the truck forward, now speeding faster than I had ever gone, desperate to escape the figure that still stood behind me. The fog thickened again, blurring everything around me, and for a few terrifying moments I couldn't see anything. I kept driving, my heart pounding, adrenaline pumping through my veins, until the sound of the engine seemed to snap me out of it. The truck was still moving, the headlights now piercing through the fog, and in the distance I saw the lights of a small town. I had made it. I didn't look back. I pulled into a gas station just outside the town, my hands still trembling, my breath coming in short gasps. I got out of the truck, needing to steady myself, needing to feel like I was safe again. I looked down at my hands, which were slick with sweat, and I tried to calm my racing heart. That's when I saw something in the dust of the truck door, a single, wide footprint pressed deep into the dirt. The print was large, far too large for a person, and it was filled with a strange, dark residue, almost like something had walked right out of the shadows themselves. I didn't say a word. I couldn't bring myself to talk about it to anyone. I just fueled up, got back into my truck, and drove away, heading for home. The bridge was behind me now, but I still feel its pull. I can't explain what happened or what I saw. All I know is that something followed me across that bridge. I haven't taken that route since.
Next story.
I've been hauling freight for nearly 20 years, but there's one stretch of road I'll never drive again. It's not a particularly famous highway, not well known for accidents or ghost stories. Just a quiet back road in the middle of nowhere, somewhere between Spokane and Missoula. But there's something about that road, something that I can't explain, that has kept me from going near it since that night. It was late in the evening when I hit the road, heading west. The rain had been falling steadily for a few hours, and the night was dark. The headlights of my rig cut through the rain, casting an eerie glow on the slick asphalt. I didn't expect much on that road, just the usual solitary drive through the empty wilderness with the occasional deer or raccoon darting across the road. I was about 2 hours in when I started to notice something. It was subtle at first. A light in the distance coming up fast in my rearview mirror. I thought it was another truck, probably someone trying to pass me. But the closer it got, the more I realized it wasn't a truck, it was something else entirely. The lights were bright, but too bright. Almost blinding. They didn't flicker like they should have. They just stayed perfectly steady, like they were fixed in place, coming faster and faster. I checked my mirrors again, but I didn't see anything behind me. No vehicle. No truck. I should have been more cautious, but at the time, I was more curious than scared. It was a dark, rainy night, and maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, the lights came right up alongside me, as though something was running parallel to my truck. I could see the glow outside, the lights spilling across the road like headlights, but I couldn't see what was causing it. There was nothing beside me. No car. No truck. I hit the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. The truck slowed down, but the lights kept pace, right beside me, keeping just a few feet away. I could feel my grip tightening on the wheel, a cold sweat trickling down my neck. What the hell was this? I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus, but I could hear something. A soft humming sound, almost like a low engine running, but it wasn't my truck. It was coming from somewhere outside, somewhere in the dark. I glanced out the side window, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow pass by, something dark and large moving in the rain just beyond my sight. But when I turned my head fully, there was nothing there. The lights were still glowing next to me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the lights vanished. I don't mean they moved away or faded out. They disappeared entirely, like they were never there to begin with. 1 second, I could see the glowing haze beside me, and the next, it was gone, like someone had turned off a switch. My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kept driving, my hands shaking on the wheel, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. I kept expecting to see those lights again, but they didn't return. That's when I heard it. The voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it was coming from somewhere inside the cab. It was a low, raspy voice, like someone breathing in my ear. Keep going. I almost swerved off the road. I know I wasn't imagining it. I heard it clear as day. It wasn't my radio. There was no signal out here. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it felt like it was coming from right next to me. I should have stopped. I should have gotten out of the truck, called someone, anything. But I didn't. I kept driving. The next thing I remember was the feeling of the road beneath me changing. At first, it was subtle. The truck didn't feel right, Scott, like it was riding too smooth, like it wasn't making the right sounds. Then I looked out the windshield, and everything ahead of me seemed different. The road was still wet, but the lights in the distance weren't coming from the highway. They were off the road, in the trees. And they weren't the usual lights from a house or a town. These were strange, flickering, almost like they were calling me. I slowed down, my heart pounding in my chest. My head was screaming at me to keep driving, to ignore what I was seeing, but my body wouldn't listen. I found myself veering off the road, like some force was pulling me toward those lights. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. As I got closer to the lights, I realized something was wrong. There was a shape in front of them, a dark figure standing still in the rain. I stopped the truck. The figure was tall, towering even, and it was watching me. It didn't move. Its face, if you could call it that, was pale and stretched tight, its eyes glowing white like cold fire. But it wasn't just its face. The whole body seemed wrong. It was too long, too thin. Its limbs were bent at angles that made my stomach turn. And then it spoke. I've been waiting. I couldn't breathe. My hands went numb, and the truck seemed to stop moving as if the engine had died. Waiting for you. I don't know how long I sat there, but it felt like hours. The figure never moved, never blinked, never looked away from me. I couldn't look away either. It was like I was frozen in place, stuck in the grip of something beyond my control. But then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The lights in the trees blinked out. The rain kept falling, but everything felt dead quiet, as though the world had stopped. I didn't wait for anything else. I floored the accelerator and took off, not even thinking about what I was doing, just needing to get as far away as possible. I didn't look back, not once. By the time I reached Missoula, I was a wreck. I couldn't shake the image of that thing, the voice, the lights. I tried to tell a couple of other truckers at the rest stop about what happened, but they just looked at me like I was crazy, said it was probably just the stress of the road or fatigue. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. Something or someone was waiting for me out there on that road. And I'll never drive that stretch again.
Next story.
I've been a trucker for over a decade now, but I've only told this story once before, and I swear, it's a night I'll never forget. It was a routine haul. I had to drive from Chicago to a warehouse in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The weather wasn't great. Rain, wind, and the kind of fog that makes it feel like you're driving through a cloud. But that wasn't the part that stuck with me. No, it was what happened near the end of the trip. It all started around midnight. I was pushing through the hours, doing what truckers do, keeping my eyes on the road, focusing on the lane markers, and hoping the clock would hurry up. It was dead quiet, except for the sound of the engine and the rain tapping against the windshield. I was about 100 miles from Tulsa when I started to feel it. At first, I thought it was just fatigue, maybe the road starting to get to me. But there was this weird feeling creeping up on me, like I wasn't alone. I glanced around the cab, but everything was as it should be, empty except for the gear I keep in the passenger seat. Still, that feeling lingered. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the solitude of the road getting to me. But as I went on, the feeling got stronger. I wasn't just imagining it anymore. I felt like someone or something was watching me. That's when I saw it. In the rearview mirror, there was a pair of headlights coming up behind me. At first, I figured it was another trucker, probably a guy in a rush to get somewhere just like me. But as the lights got closer, I realized something wasn't right. The headlights weren't moving in a normal way. They were swerving back and forth like the vehicle was out of control. Uh, it was too erratic for a normal truck. Now, you have to understand, on long stretches like this, there's not a lot of traffic. When you do see another vehicle, it's usually a truck, and they stick to their lanes. But this thing, whatever it was weaving back and forth, speeding up and slowing down, as though it was trying to catch up to me. I didn't know what to make of it. My first instinct was to pull over, get off the highway, but before I could even think about it, the vehicle sped up and pulled right beside me. I could see it in the mirror now. A black pickup truck, and it was moving so fast I thought it was going to sideswipe me. But there was no driver. There was no one in the truck. I nearly slammed on the brakes, my heart in my throat, but before I could even react, the truck swerved away and shot down the highway, disappearing into the rain and fog. I don't know how, but the moment it vanished, I felt a shift in the air. The tension, the weight that had been pressing on me, it was gone. The road seemed quieter, like the world had exhaled a sigh of relief. But I couldn't shake the thought of that truck. How could there be no driver? How could it move like that? I kept driving, trying to push it from my mind. Maybe it was a prank, a trick of the fog, something my tired eyes had imagined. But then I saw it again. This time it was in front of me, the same black pickup sitting in the middle of the highway, blocking my lane. No lights, no movement. Just sitting there like a stone in the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. The truck screeched to a halt just inches from the pickup. The fog was so thick now I could barely see the hood of my truck. I couldn't see past it, but I could feel it. Something was wrong. The truck wasn't supposed to be there. There wasn't even a road sign or a rest area nearby. It was just there. I sat there, frozen, not sure what to do. I should have gotten out, called for help, but something told me not to move. Something told me to wait. That's when I saw the figure. A man walking toward me from the fog. I couldn't see much of him at first, just a silhouette, tall and thin, his arms hanging by his sides. He wasn't moving quickly, just slowly, steadily, with no urgency, as though he knew I wasn't going anywhere. The figure got closer, and that's when I saw his face, or rather, what was left of it. His skin was stretched tight, almost paper thin, and his eyes, those cold, empty eyes, were fixed on me. His mouth was wide open, but there were no words, no sound, just the eerie quiet. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that thing. But eventually, I managed to snap out of it. My hand shot to the gear shift, and I put the truck in reverse. I didn't care about anything else. I just needed to get away from him, from whatever that thing was. I didn't even care if I hit something. I threw the truck in gear and backed up as fast as I could, my eyes never leaving the figure. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, there was nothing behind me. The pickup was gone. The man was gone. I kept driving. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down until I reached the outskirts of Tulsa. I pulled into a rest area, my hands shaking, my heart still racing. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw or didn't see. The next day, when I told a couple of other truckers at the diner about it, they all went quiet. They'd all heard about the phantom driver on that stretch of highway, but nobody had seen it themselves. Some said it was the ghost of a man who died in an accident years ago. Others said it was just a myth, a story truckers told each other to pass the time. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. So, if you're ever driving through Northern California in the middle of the night and you see a black pickup truck in the fog, just remember this. Don't stop. Don't look. Just keep driving and don't ever get too close.
Next story.
I've been driving trucks across this country for years, but I'll never forget what happened on a stretch of highway in Northern California one cold winter night. It's the kind of thing that haunts you. Something stays with you when you're alone on the road and the night stretches out in front of you like an endless black pit. It was late, around 2 a.m. I was about 30 miles out from a small town called Willow Creek. The roads were slick from the rain, and the mist was so thick that I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me. The truck's headlights barely cut through the haze. I was making good time, though, and the road was empty. No other vehicles, just me and the darkness. That's when I first saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road, right at the edge of the headlights. It didn't make sense. I mean, who would be out here in the middle of nowhere on a night like this? I thought maybe it was a hitchhiker, though I had my doubts. I wasn't exactly in the mood to pick anyone up, not with the way the weather was and the creepy vibes the fog was giving off. But I slowed down anyway, just out of caution, you know? Maybe someone had car trouble, maybe they needed help. As I got closer, I saw it was a man, tall, with a long dark coat, and his back was to me. His posture was strange. He wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still in the mist. I thought, maybe he's just waiting for a ride. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. I rolled down the window, the cool air rushing in, and yelled out, "Hey, you need a ride?" No response. I slowed the truck even more, trying to get a better look. Still nothing. But as I came to a stop right next to him, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. His hands weren't normal. They were wrong. His fingers were too long, and they were twitching, jerking, like he couldn't control them. I couldn't tell if he was injured or if there was something else going on. My breath caught in my throat, and I almost hit the gas to drive away, but something kept me there. I kept staring at him, waiting for him to move, to speak, anything. But he didn't. And then I saw his face. I'll never forget it. His face was pale, unnaturally pale. His eyes were wide open, and his pupils were almost black, like the void of space. But what really got to me was his mouth. It wasn't a normal mouth. It was stretched wide open, impossibly wide, like someone had ripped it apart. His lips were cracked, and the skin was peeling, but there was no blood. It was as though he was smiling, but it wasn't a smile. It was a gaping hole where his mouth should have been. I didn't know what to do. Fear gripped me like a vice. My mind was screaming at me to drive, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't move. It was like my body had frozen. And then, just as I was about to floor the accelerator and leave him behind, the man's head slowly turned toward me. His eyes locked with mine, and for a second, I thought I saw something in them. Something not human. His grin, if you could call it that, seemed to stretch even wider. And then he opened his mouth. I couldn't hear anything at first, just silence. But then the sound came, a soft whisper, just barely audible, like it was coming from the very depths of the earth. "Turn around," it whispered. I don't know why, but I listened. I don't know if it was instinct or pure terror, but I put the truck in reverse, my hands shaking as I looked back at the man. But when I checked the mirror, he was gone. Just gone. My heart was pounding in my chest as I quickly shifted back into drive and sped off. I didn't stop until I reached Willow Creek. I pulled into the gas station there, hands still trembling, mind racing with what had just happened. I went inside, but the cashier, an older guy, barely looked up from his paper. I asked him, "You ever see anyone on the side of the road out there? Tall guy, long coat?" Real weird. He didn't even blink, just nodded and said, "Oh yeah, you're talking about the hitchhiker. He's been seen around these parts for years. Strange thing is nobody ever picks him up. He just stands there, never moves, just waiting." I stared at him confused, and he continued, "They say he's been dead for years. Some say he was a trucker, got into an accident out there in the fog, and his ghost still haunts the road." I didn't want to believe him. I didn't want to think about it. But that's when I realized something else. The man, he wasn't just standing by the side of the road that night. He was waiting for me. I haven't driven that route since. I don't know what I saw out there, but I do know that there's something on those roads, something that's not alive. I don't care what anyone says. I don't care if it's a ghost or just some urban legend. What I saw that night, it was real. And I know it's still out there, somewhere in the fog, waiting for the next driver to come by.